And so we are now ready to transition to our next Tri-Talk. And this is on the theme of reframing Africa and why narratives matter. This Tri-Talk is going to be delivered by Moky Makura. Moky is the Executive Director of Africa No Filter. Now, Africa No Filter is an advocacy organization, and they are dedicating to reshaping Africa's perceptions. Moky has worked as a TV anchor, an actor, producer, an author, and a publisher. And she's also previously served as the head of communication, the African head of communications at the Gates Foundation, and she's also led communications at the Tony Elumelu Foundation. She speaks globally about narrative, the creative industries, media development, and the power of storytelling to influence perception, investment, and policy across Africa. Let's give Moky a warm round of applause as she comes online.
Great. Hello and welcome. And I'm really sorry I'm not there in person. I used to live in Johannesburg, but I don't anymore. But I've got 15 minutes to tell you about the story that is killing Africa. When I was introduced, it was clear that I believe in the power of storytelling, but I'm going to tell you a very quick story. I've only got 15 minutes. So I was on a train in Europe and I was going to, from Berlin to Bonn. I was going to speak at a media conference. A Norwegian businessman got onto the train with me and he sat in my carriage and we started talking. He asked me where I was from. I told him I was from Nigeria. I asked him if he had ever been there or if he'd ever been to the continent. He said no. I asked him why. He said, well, because Africa wasn't a place that he felt he would go, he would enjoy. He felt it was a place that, you know, was kind of like poverty and just violence and just not a nice place that he would want to go to. And I asked him where he got that impression. And he told me quite dismissively almost that, yeah, from newspapers, from stories, from films. And he's a businessman. He could potentially have invested in Africa. He could potentially have come here on holiday. But his perception, which was based on the stories he heard, was keeping him from the continent. And it led me to know for a fact that stories matter. Stories influence your perception, they influence your behavior. And the current story about Africa is this. It's one that we are a broken continent, that we somehow are dependent and we're lacking, that we don't have even the agency to create the change that we need. We're broken down in debt. I know the conversation before me was all about financing and capital, and I'll talk about that. But it just seems as if somehow this continent never seems to work. As the introduction said, I run an organization called Africa No Filter, and this is the image that I see of us. We're like this organization fighting superhero power, fighting negative stereotypes about the continent, because there is work to be done. One of the things that we do a lot of is research. And I'm going to talk about 3 pieces of research that we've done. One is called, it's with the Global Media Index, where we ranked 20 global institutions or media outlets that cover Africa on how they cover Africa. The things that we saw that concerned me is that the story across all 20 of them, and I'm talking from The Guardian to The Washington Post, to the BBC to CNN, were these stories. It was either politics, so often elections, but poverty, but it was always crisis. What was interesting is that most of these publications, even though they say they cover Africa, actually only cover just over half the continent. A lot of countries don't even get a say in. The voices are not representative. In a lot of global media, it is not African voices we hear. It's actually sort of elite, authoritative voices. And when Africans show up, we're often victims. There's very little coverage in global media about innovation, about culture and progress. Basically, the narrative is not neutral. It is patent, and we need to do something about it. I think it's really important because the story has real world implications. 60% of young Africans across this continent want to leave. And even if they can't leave, they're not building, staying, thinking about the continent as a place of opportunity. They're waiting to get out. Immigration across Africa, well, if you sit in Europe where I sit, well, in the UK, migration, Africans coming in, it's a huge political pressure point. A lot of countries are becoming more right-wing, trying to get immigrants out, and Africa is on that agenda. And if you have an African passport, and I am Nigerian, and my passport is probably one of the worst in the world, we are discriminated against. I mean, visa inequality in terms of the visa prices you have to pay to get in, the length of time it takes to get you a visa. But the most important conversation I think that's happening right now in this side of the world is the loss or the amount of money that we are no longer getting in aid. And I know South Africa has definitely been in the news alongside Kenya with a drop in funding for its HIV programs. And that is destined to go down. And it's not just America. A lot of the other countries have already been dropping aid. America just made it very, very sudden. So the story of the continent actually influences who stays, who leaves, who invests, and actually who gets left behind. The second piece of research that I want to talk about is one we did, what was called the cost of media stereotypes. And basically, we looked at how much this negative profiling of the continent actually costs us. And the way we did it was we looked at the risk premium African countries pay in terms of sovereign debt. And we extrapolated that across the continent, and we came up with a figure of $4.2 billion, which is actually enough to educate 12 million children every single year. But it's actually just a fraction of the total investment, because if you look at actual investments that don't happen because people don't want to come to Africa because of perceived risk of corruption, and the lots of other things that don't happen, we can't even count the number of people who don't come here to spend their holidays or don't come to tourism, come to South Africa because they're scared of the crime. That is not included in here. The point is that our countries are paying more. Argentina has defaulted on its debt 9 times, but yet they pay the same or less than we do as Africa. The reality of this number for businesses is that the countries are borrowing money more expensively, therefore our banks are borrowing money more expensively. Therefore, they are giving it to small businesses and to business much more expensively. In Europe and the US, the average borrowing costs, the interest rates businesses pay is between 4 to 8%. In Africa, it's 15 to 30%. I know I have a friend who runs a business. She's paying 33% on an overdraft every time she dips into it for her business. 2 to 6 times more? How is that sustainable? The challenge for us is that you cannot build globally competitive businesses on that amount of interest. There's this best brands that's done every single year. The 2025 one showed that only 11 of the top 100 brands in Africa are actually African. And this is a survey that's done across all countries, sort of measuring brands. We cannot build huge businesses if we're borrowing at that amount. Now, the third report I'm going to quickly talk about is one we did called Stereotypes About Africa in Britain. And what we did was that we worked with the University of Bath, and we looked at, and well, they actually did, they surveyed over nearly 2,000 people in the US and UK, asking them what they thought about Africa. Their findings were interesting. Key thing is society was seen in a negative light. They linked Africa with instability and just a harsh environment. And the good things they saw, which they always see, is the nature of animals. That's what they associated if they had to push and were pushed about what is good in Africa. Stereotypes reduce their intent to purchase, because one of the alarming things that came out for me is that people in this survey felt that they would not buy anything important like a computer, something technology driven or something health driven. So they wouldn't buy computers and they wouldn't buy drugs from Africa. So no matter how much we build our businesses, that negative stereotype, that bias is already there. And we need to change that. But how did we get here? Because it didn't happen yesterday. The gentleman on the left is a man called Henry Morton Stanley, who was essentially, I guess you'd call an explorer and a journalist. But he was the first person that really documented and gave Europe, particularly England and English people, a perception about Africa. He wrote about us as savages and, just a lot of horrible stuff. It's all there on the internet. You can have a look. But at the time, that was what the lingo was. But he was the one that actually gave people a big impression about what the continent was, because many people had not been. On the right-hand side is a gentleman called Bob Geldof. Some of you may or may not know him. He ran a band, or he had a band called, gosh, the Boomtown Rats. But in 1985, he held one of the biggest concerts ever. People like Queen, Madonna at the time came, and it was all in aid of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was going through a massive famine. Over 1 million people had died. And he put on a benefit concert, which was watched by over 1 billion people in 150 different countries. Today, that equivalent would be getting Beyonce or Taylor Swift and Drake all on the same stage. Everybody was watching it. But these two pictures tell me something, that much of the narrative about us, it's been going for a long time, it lasts for generations, but it was actually built externally by other people outside the continent on our behalf. In 1985, these were the images. The top left-hand corner is Live Aid. It was absolutely massive. The rest are just the images that went across the world about Africa. Like I said, it was watched in 150 countries. The challenge for us is that actually the famine was in one country. It didn't represent all of Africa, but there was a dark side to it. 1985, in my opinion, sealed the continent's image as a broken one. This is when the actual sort of saving Africa industry began, when Madonna came to Africa and adopted a child with parents, when people were coming to help us all the time, and as if we just couldn't do it ourselves, and that our problems were so simple that it just needed £1 to save us. That was in 1985. The problem with that is that most of the people in decision-making positions today came out of this era. They were influenced by this era. So they are bank CEOs, they are heading up development organizations. That image was in 1985. This image is 2026. I'm telling you, things have not changed as much as we can when it comes to how the world sees us. This is a picture taken from the cover of New York Times. This is about the USAID cuts. Again, an African, nameless African dying, and we feel it's okay to take a picture and slap it on a newspaper. Again, it just speaks of, we just don't have what it takes to create the change. But the reality is things have changed. I'm going to ask you in the audience, where do you see your country? Is it on the left-hand side where global perceptions are, and a lot of local perceptions, because these narratives also affect us as Africans? Do you see, guns? Do you see poverty? Or do you see, on the other extreme, Wakanda, a place where everything's amazing? The reality is we're right bang somewhere in the middle. We are not as bad as the world thinks, and sometimes how we ourselves think. We're in the middle. The problem is that we need to, we're a continent on the move. We just need to make ourselves seen more. There's a lot happening on the continent. So how do we go from a broken continent that lacks no agency to one that does? One of the things I heard on stage is that we don't have a problem with finding solutions. There are many solutions. I think the capital, which we talked about, we need to mobilize domestic capital. We shouldn't be relying on outside funding. And a lot of countries have. That's why I like the Accra Reset, which if you've heard about, it's basically Ghana just saying that we are going to do this ourselves. We need better institutions, things like the African Credit Rating Agency. They've established that. There's lots of African banks, the AFC, Afrexim Bank, who are doing things on the continent. But the one big area that I feel is lacking, that we are not doing enough to support, is the narrative. And that's the bit that I care about. When it comes to narrative, we know that the only way to change a narrative is to actually change the stories that feed that narrative. So what we as an advocacy organization tell people to do is to tell better stories and to tell more stories. And by better stories, I want us to share the stories of progress, the things that are happening, the policies that are working, the places that are just better. We need to do that more, but also we need to tell more of the stories. We just don't have enough. Now, I can't tell you how much content there is on the internet, but I can tell you how much there is on Wikipedia. So using Wikipedia as a proxy for the internet, we know that less than 4% of the content on Wikipedia is African. There is more about Paris, the city in Europe, than there is about Africa, the continent, on Wikipedia. And less than 1% of that content is written by Africans. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to rush through this, just this quick slide. Every single headline on this slide is a real one. So it's not a lack of stories. It is just a lack of visibility of our stories. So I want to ask you, how are you telling the Africa story? Are you even telling it? Are you thinking about it at all? Are you inadvertently reinforcing these negative stereotypes? And just, very quickly, people, tell stories, about the work they're doing, but in order to tell that story, they're highlighting the problem. And I've seen it time and time again, where actually organizations, individuals really focus on the problem we have in Africa, never talking about the challenge. I mean, the opportunity there. I think there are things that you can do. If you are an organization, you can fund more storytelling ecosystems. Media is one of the least funded business opportunities on the continent. The creative sector, everybody talks about it, but very few people are actively funding in it. A lot of the time, we don't know how the model works. We don't know how musicians make money or content creators are making money. Is it a business opportunity? But there is opportunity there. We need to spend time amplifying African voices. We need to deliberately, shift to opportunity framing, asset framing, as opposed to the negative or the deficit framing. And we need to share the story. But the most important thing I think you can do is join the Opportunity Africa movement. I'm going to tell you very quickly what that is. It is something that Africa No Filter is starting. It's a platform of visibility to shine a spotlight on the institutions, the brands, the storytellers, the campaigns, the people who are making a difference. And the reason we're doing this is that we need to flood the internet with the progress stories. I believe that this campaign is different, mainly because it is practitioner-led, it's African-led, it's driven by a bunch of communications people who are a steering committee. It's internal as much as external, because people often don't realize that the narrative affects us as much as it does external people, us being Africans. But also, it's not designed to be a separate campaign. It's designed to be a unifying campaign that actually brings all the many initiatives together. The Creative Council, you may recognize Tebe Kalifeng, South African, who's represented. There's, who else is on here? Togo Modisa, who's head of comms for Brand South Africa. So we have a big group of people from across Africa, all of them in the brand and the marketing and communication space, who are the Creative Council for this. The campaign itself will launch on the 25th of May, which is Africa Day, and it'll look a little bit like this. You may start seeing this, so you're privy to this. But please go to opportunityafrica.africa, take a look at what the initiative it is, and join, and absolutely join, because it's so important we share more about our story. It is so important that we actually let people see that the continent has made a lot more progress than we think, because what gets seen gets counted. What gets counted matters, and we do matter. So let's not wait. That is my talk. Are you ready to join?
Moky, it's always an absolute pleasure being in conversation with you. And I can assure you that the round of applause in the room is absolutely resounding. We've got hundreds more people online, which I'm certainly are also deeply thankful for your contribution today. And so, Moky, we're not going to take any questions, but we're going to thank you kindly and say continue to do the good work. And of course, thank you for sharing the information around Opportunity Africa. We certainly will be supporting that. Ladies and gentlemen, Moky Makura.